Or we put restrictions on it. They have to read it too.
But so just raise your hand when I ask the question. So this is a multiple choice question.
Oh.
So in the state of Texas, with regard to the Texas and American flag, which of the following is true? A, the Texas flag is flown below the American flag. B, the Texas flag is flown at the same level as the American flag. Or C, the Texas flag is flown above the American flag. Anybody want to take a shot at this? An A. Below the American flag. A is actually not correct. Anybody else want to take it? It is flown at the same level as the American flag. Dr. Cherry and I were in graduate school together. This was like one of the things I had to learn. I had thought that's part of it was odd. I've never seen that before. In North Carolina, the American flag's always at the top. I was like, why are they flying the Texas flag at the same level? And I was like, well, Texas is its own country. As Dr. Cherry will say, he comes from the Republic of Texas. So, all right. So, now this one is a little bit harder. So this was one that Dr. Cherry actually gave me. So as you may know, actually I didn't realize this myself, but according to sort of native Texans, Sam Houston was the second and fourth president of Texas, not necessarily the first. Although most Americans think he was the first. But
Yankee propaganda.
It's Yankee propaganda. Can anyone tell me Sam Houston's nickname?
Good one.
And just to kind of let you know, he was a colorful character. Any guesses on that? Anybody have a guess? What was his nickname? No. Do you have any hints for this one? Yeah. They did. All right, so I'm gonna give you this one, and we'll go to it. So his nickname was Big Drunk.
Big Drunk.
All right. So this is an easier one. Can anyone tell me? I'll try this one. See, I think this was a kind of fun. So Dr. Cherry graduated from graduate school in 1999. Can anyone tell me who the governor of Texas was when Dr. Cherry graduated from Rice University?
I can't.
I'll give you a hint. This is a famous. It went on and did bigger things besides being the governor. All right, so let me take a moment to introduce Dr. Cherry, and then we'll get going. So Dr. Mark J. Cherry is the Patricia A. Hayes Professor in Applied Ethics and Professor of Philosophy at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. He earned his undergraduate degree in philosophy from the University of Houston and his doctorate degree in philosophy from Rice University in Houston, Texas. His research encompasses ethics and bioethics together with social and political philosophy. He is author of this book, Bioethics After God, Morality, Culture, and Medicine, put out by the University of Notre Dame Press in 2024. Sex, Family, and the Cultural Wars, put out by Rutledge in 2016. And Kidney for Sale by Owner, Organs, Transplantation in the Market, put out by Georgetown University Press in 2005 and 2015. He's also published numerous edited books, journal articles, book chapters, and other publications. He's the editor of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, senior editor of Christian Bioethics, and an editor-in-chief of Healthcare Ethics Committee Forum. He is co-editor of the book series, The Annals of Bioethics, and editor of the book series, Philosophical Studies in Contemporary Culture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cherry.
Where do I put this?
However you want to clip it.
The beard will get in the way. Sorry, general incompetence. Absolutely. I think the only reason I survived this long is I married well. That's sort of what it comes down to. So, first of all, y'all, thank you very much for having me here tonight. It really is a great joy. Professor Parker has been promising me Parker barbecue for as long as we've known each other, and this is the very first opportunity I've had to come up here and enjoy Parker barbecue. So thank you very much, and y'all, thanks for coming tonight. I'm going to try to be as boring as I possibly can. Being a philosophy professor, I want to make sure I hit all those right stereotypes. Otherwise, people I might destroy things. The topic of my talk tonight is called, the title is called Killing Off the Elderly, Sick, and Other Unwanted, Expensive Patients. Right? Why a Christian perspective really matters. Because what I'm going to try to do as we go through it is draw a kind of a dichotomy between what one can see through just sort of general secular philosophy and what Christians know to be true. Right? And so that one can really see strongly the nature of the conflict and recognize why it's very important to be a Christian and very important to be a robust Christian and to live in that kind of a fashion in the world. So that you could take care of your patients, take care of family members in various ways, and watch over the kinds of things that are happening. Part of what we're going to talk about are very depressing changes. So assisted suicide has been legalized in various places in the United States, Oregon, California, Washington, a number of other, Vermont, Washington, D.C. But places like Canada actually legalized active euthanasia. And it is where they actively kill the patient, and it is a growing procedure. And I have a number of colleagues up there who engage in it, where they actually kill the patient and are super proud of it. I mean, they just love it. So they become sort of evangelists for killing of patients under certain circumstances. And part of what I want to sort of show you that dichotomy, so you get a sense of it, and then we can have whatever kind of conversation, questions you all would like to have. So the question that we start out with is it wrong for physicians intentionally to kill patients if those individuals consent to be killed? What about physicians helping patients to kill themselves? In much of the Western world, the answer to these questions in a secular way is just there isn't much really to say about it. No one worries about it as much as one might think they do anymore. Indeed, for much of secular bioethics, the preferred language to describe such practices has become something like medical assistance in dying. That's what they call it in Canada. Now, notice how rhetorical that is. I mean, who doesn't want assistance when you're dying? We want pain management. We want, maybe help with eating and drinking, other kinds of things like this. But we don't think of it necessarily as encompassing somebody actually killing us. And that's how it's being phrased in Canada. Quite fascinating and scary. Because active euthanasia and assisted suicide for so many people no longer raise important secular ethical concerns rather than ensuring that the patient is actually given consent. But recognize while these activities are often represented as if they were about, here you have, we'll call our patient Joe Bob. Any Joe Bobs in here? I don't want to accidentally, kill off people. So here we have Joe Bob, and Joe Bob, the idea is for us to imagine Joe Bob is just maybe dying of cancer, is in horrible, intractable pain, and says, please, someone, please do something. And the idea is we're supposed to imagine this as sort of being the doctor comes in and in sort of an act of dignity, kills off Joe Bob. But I want you to recognize while that case might exist, it's not necessarily even the standard case. In May of 2018, an Australian scientist by the name of David Goodall was 104 years old. He wasn't, as far as I can find in literature, dying or of any particular disease. He wasn't particularly in pain or anything like that, but he was 104. He decided he'd done enough in his life, so he flew from Australia to Switzerland, and he said, please have me put down, and he was. December of 2022, Les Landry, a 65-year-old Canadian woman, requested that she be euthanized. According to media reports, Mr. Landry used a wheelchair, had epilepsy and diabetes, and straightforwardly acknowledged that the reason for applying for euthanasia was simply financial. Between a recent reduction in his income and an increase in his rent, he was worried about going homeless, so he said, I don't want to do that, please instead euthanize me. In an interview, again back in 2022, several months before utilizing euthanasia, Jennifer Hatch, who was only 37 years old in Canada, gave an interview in which she indicated that she was unable to obtain adequate care for her underlying condition, a medical condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and she just said it would be easier and faster if you simply had me put down. Okay? So that is this idea. It's become part and parcel of the culture. It now accounts in Canada for something like 4.5% of all deaths every year. Okay. In Canada, you do not have to be terminal. You do not have to be in the imminence of death. You just have to have what they call irremediable pain, where irremediable pain gets defined by the individual who's in theory in pain. And we're going to talk more about that as we go, because it turns out the most common reason cited in Canada for requesting medical assistance in dying is the loss of the ability to engage in activities that the individual found to be meaningful activities. That is to say, they aren't necessarily in physical pain in the way I've described Joe Bob, but rather they've just decided it's time. So the framing question for the talk and our discussion tonight is regards the role of Christianity in bioethics in these kinds of healthcare debates. As I argue, this kind of a question regards very foundational questions with regard to moral epistemology. That is to say, how one comes to know things. Right? That's why we're going to talk about the difference between sort of a secular epistemology, how one comes to know things, versus a Christian one. Most of the world knows me as a kind of a libertarian, and I've argued, and we'll talk about a little bit tonight, that secular philosophical analysis simply cannot demonstrate why it might necessarily be wrong to engage in these kinds of activities. Although it definitely cannot demonstrate why doctors ought to participate or taxpayers should also finance either. And we'll talk about sort of illustrations of that. But through the grace of God, I am an Antiochian Orthodox Christian. I don't know how many of you know Orthodox Christianity. So if you know the Greek Orthodox, same religion, only I'm Arabic. Right? So that's at least my religious background. And this time of year, we all greet each other with Christ is risen. And everyone responds with, indeed, he is risen. Right? As a Christian, I know euthanasia and assisted suicide to be deeply, deeply sinful practices. To save for God's grace, place one at real eternal risk. These kinds of forms of medical termination are directed against basic human goods and deny God's dominion over the world. This kind of death sunders one from the Christian duty for humility and submission to God, even unto death. In such matters, we prefer the terminology of murder and self-murder, because they capture the depth of the spiritual realities at stake. These and related religious and secular implications of killing patients will be described as we go through around section 3. But what I'm going to try to show you is that to really understand the deep wrong associated with euthanasia and assisted suicide, you really need to know who God is. It's hard to understand these things properly outside of a knowledge of God. And if you don't know who God is and how he commands, one tends to shift in other kinds of ways. And I'll try to illustrate some of that with some data, again, from Canada, as well as from the Netherlands and places like this. So section 2 is called Secular Ethics and Secular Bioethics, where morality is sort of a do-it-yourself project. Right? You've heard the phrase, I did it my way. Well, that's kind of how it often works. Again, Christianity's opposition to euthanasia, assisted suicide, is grounded in its knowledge that such actions violate the prohibition against murder and self-murder. That an individual consents or otherwise signals to willingness to die, as in cases of voluntary active euthanasia, does not change the deep sinfulness of the practice. Think of it like this, just because your spouse says it's okay to go have an affair doesn't mean you haven't committed adultery, right? The consent doesn't cure, right? Killing persons radically harms one's relationship with God. Killing another to avoid the burdens of caring for that individual while he or she is dying, or to help that person or even oneself escape the indignities, the suffering, or other challenges at the end of life, would be seriously spiritually harmful. As H. Tristram Engelhart Jr. explores the point, and here I'm just going to quote him. He says, "The exemplars of good living and dying are the saints. They live and die in a way that has no place for assisted suicide or euthanasia. They've never acted to avoid suffering by suicide or euthanasia. One learns from them, from their lives and deaths, how to draw the line between murder, suicide, and humble self-sacrifice. What is offered as an experiential knowledge of how to aim at union of God. This experiential, this noetic knowledge of progress from oneself to God opens the door to understanding of why one should voluntarily accept suffering." Right? The saints show us how we ought to live, but also how we ought to accept suffering and how we ought to orient ourselves towards death as best we can. As I was mentioning at dinner, one of the prayers that we pray every Sunday at liturgy is, "Protect us, O Lord, from an unforeseen death." We want to see it coming. We don't want to sort of die in our sleep like a good yuppie after good financial planning, but with no pain and suffering. We want to see it happening. We want to know it's coming. It doesn't mean we're looking for pain, but we would like to have time to repent, to learn to love God better, to love our spouses and our children, things of this nature. Because only God is the master of life and death. Facilitating one's own death to avoid being a burden to others or to oneself has always been recognized as a rejection of Christian asceticism, of the ways in which we must, in fact, emulate Christ. Including, we Christians are obliged to take on Christ, including his submission even unto suffering and death. Consequently, Christianity has always recognized suicide and euthanasia as serious violations of the commandment not to kill. Such practices reject the humility and the holiness of Christ's life and death. What happens, the question then, so we have a Christian robust understanding. The question then is, what happens to these kind of spiritual knowledge once you remove God from the equation? Once you've removed God, what happens? Okay. And part of what I want you to see is that the challenge is absent knowing who God is and how he commands. Moral claims are set in a particular culture, in a particular place and time in history. And they routinely don't seem to be binding on people unless they decide simply to follow them. We find instead that moral pluralism, the idea of different moralities, different people following different things. You may have many students from different religions and cultures and practices, secular and atheist, so forth. They simply don't see Christian morality as being all that meaningful. Elizabeth Anscombe, a well-known Roman Catholic philosopher, appreciated, for example, that once moral claims are made without knowledge of or reference to God, she says it's doubtful they'd even be remotely compelling. She says, quote, "It is as if the notion criminal were to remain when criminal law and criminal courts have been abolished and forgotten. Without God, concepts of immoral action are analogous to concepts of illegal action in the absence of legislators or police to identify illegal acts, much less courts or prisons to adjudicate or punish individuals for them." For those of you who might be familiar with a famous German philosopher by the name of Habermas. Habermas was an atheist, very influential in Western Europe, and Habermas, in some of his writings, has reflected on this exact problem. He sees the horror of the Holocaust, and he says, "This is evil." And then he puzzles. He says, "I want the word evil to mean something important." He says, "But I don't believe in God. What can evil mean other than I don't like it and other people don't like it? Maybe 1,000, 10,000 years from now, no one will even remember it." He's puzzled. He doesn't understand that, doesn't like that. He's worried about that. But the puzzle here is to recognize that without God as the author and justification of morality, as well as the source of ultimate sanctions, rewards, and punishments, the significance of many supposedly immoral actions is only the significance that specific persons, cultures, or societies attribute to these actions. Acting immorally in a secular sense possesses very little significance beyond prudential concerns, worries about being caught and punished. As an example, just as an example, try to get a sense of it. Consider the way in which traditional Christian appreciation of the immorality of sexual activity outside of the monogamous marriage of man and woman have ceased to be plausible for large sections of Western society. They just can't see it. I explain this to my students. No sense of why this might be an important issue. Right? Casual, consensual, recreational sexual activity is regarded as at least morally permissible, perhaps good. The prudential implications of this widespread moral judgment are significant, though. Among the most obvious potential negative consequences of sexual activity outside of traditional forms of marriage are significant financial and medical costs of sexually transmitted diseases. It's about $19 billion a year in direct medical costs in the United States. The majority of that borne by young people, between about 16 and about 25, but also in older groups and so forth. Very expensive. Let's see. There's also, of course, the distinct possibility that one will pass on these diseases to others and increase the overall percentage of children born outside of wedlock. Individuals routinely pass on the costs of their sexually transmitted diseases to innocent third parties through increased insurance premiums, through taxpayer-financed health care, and there's well-documented disadvantages for children, social, emotional, psychological, and financial, raised outside of marriage. Once these kinds of outcomes, though, are secularly accepted, socially accepted, or outright ignored, it becomes implausible for people to conclude that sexual activity outside of traditional marriage is morally wrong. Provided that's consensual, sexual activity for so many people provides just another itch to scratch. Each person here defines his own understanding of the good of such practices for himself with consenting others. Without God, the morality of such issues has no specific content. Right? Content gets put into it by particular persons, by particular cultures, by particular places and time. And if there are no sanctions for immorality, there's no final motivation to be moral either. One's just going to get different accounts, the right, the good, the virtuous, and the just. Again, here, while the morality of sexual activity outside of the monogamous marriage of husband and wife provides a useful illustration, the conclusion is similar for judgments with regard to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Having rejected the traditional Christian knowledge of God, who he is, and how he commands, and how we're supposed to be in relationship with him, secular advocates can no longer appreciate why it matters that we have restrictions against killing other persons and helping people engage in self-killing in the medical establishment. Just can't see it anymore. Instead, it seems like something which is good that one should in fact be engaging in. When we rebrand the killing of patients as medical care, we have a radical shift in what it is to be a physician, what it is to engage in medicine, and so forth. These practices require that we rethink the medical profession without any of its traditional, moral, professional, even legal restraints against intentionally killing patients. As physicians are taught that euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide fall legitimately amongst the usual menu of treatments that physicians may or often require to offer patients, and from which patients may choose or even demand from their physicians, the professional ethos of medicine radically changes. So colleagues that I have in Canada who are against assisted suicide and euthanasia, who are Christians, they tell me how challenging it is because if they're an oncologist, cancer doctor, one of the things that happens to so many of them, and it depends on the province, the law might be that they're supposed to say to the patient, we can treat you this way, we can treat you this way, or you can show up next week Tuesday and we can just have you euthanized. And insofar as the individual, the doctor doesn't think that euthanasia is a good thing, it's murder, then by law in some of the provinces they're actually required to to work to transfer the patient to somebody who will do it. Now, I want you to wrap your head around that, right? That's sort of like my next door neighbor coming up to me and saying, Mark, I don't like my wife much. Could you kill her for me, please? I tell him, look, Matt, I don't kill people. I mean, he says, well, I understand you're a Christian, you don't engage in murdering people, but surely you know somebody. Give me that person's business card. Aiding and abetting, quite seriously. Killing patients has come to be thought of as morally no different than putting down a dog whose life has become, in our judgment, too painful. Gerald Kelly, writing along in 1957, so quite some time ago, summarizes the point in the following way. He says, quote, it likens man to a mere animal. It makes pain the greatest evil in the world. It ignores the fact that no one suffers save through the will of God, that through suffering a man can beautify his character, atone for his sins, take a special part in the sublime work of redemption, and win for himself an eternity of glory. This does not mean, of course, that Christians deify pain and sit idly by while men suffer. There's also something Christ-like in alleviating pain and helping the sufferer and trying to conquer disease. There's nothing either Christian or Christ-like in killing the sufferer to relieve the suffering. The idea of judgments that some human lives are less worthwhile due to age or illness or pain, it shifts medicine's focus and its application. Yet without God, secular morality routinely cannot provide definitive moral judgments against such killing, as we're seeing as euthanasia laws grow up in all kinds of places in the world. And Canada's not the first. They were slow adopters in this sense. We had Belgium and Switzerland and a number of other places. Really remarkable shifts. Indeed, many people in the world of bioethics find the euthanizing of patients both personally virtuous and professionally fulfilling. Now, when I say that, people look at me like, no, that couldn't possibly be true. Maybe it's done occasionally out of strict necessity or something. Well, as Professor Parker mentioned, I run a number of academic journals because one has to do something to keep oneself off the street and out of trouble. And one of the journals I run is called Healthcare Ethics Committee Forum, and we did an entire issue written by men and women in Canada who were part of the change of the law and were super enthusiastic about it. And we would occasionally, as part of the organization of this, would have a sort of a Zoom conference about how they were putting things together. So I encouraged them to really put down what they really thought about these kinds of things so I could really document what was taking place. And she one time told me she was up to 20 patients. And after we got off the Zoom conversation, I went downstairs to see my wife, who was sitting having coffee with a friend of hers, and I said to both of them, I just got off a Zoom meeting with a serial killer who's up to 20 victims. Now, my wife, Molly, knew what I was talking about. Her friend was like, excuse me? What's going on? Okay, so I just sort of stop and explain what's happening. But it is a remarkable. They are enthusiastic, literally, about it. But at stake here, what I want you to see is there's a foundational knowledge challenge, an epistemological challenge. Because there are irresolvable tensions amongst various possible competing moral perspectives. We have significant moral pluralism in moral theory, as well as in commitment, intuition, and judgment. And secular reason can't set those aside. It just can't resolve all of those differences. Instead, it always confronts, in its secular fashion, an irreversible plurality of competing moralities, principles, perspectives, divergent accounts of moral rationality, grounded in various rankings and definitions of cardinal virtues, right-making conditions, assertions of virtue or vice, competing accounts of human flourishing. And it has no particular way of saying this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way to do things, because again, it is simply secular. There is no ultimate foundation here. So, should euthanasia be understood as harm or benefit, a virtue or vice, just or unjust? In the secular world, the answer depends completely on one's background, moral perspective, and interests. Right? Without God, morality, as I said, becomes a kind of a do-it-yourself project. Each person, much like Milton's Satan, Paradise Lost, defines ethical standards for himself. Tell me somebody's read Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay, a couple of really short quotes. They're really short. In book 1, Satan says the following. He's standing in hell, and he raises his fists, and he says, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. 'Tis better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And then in book 4, he says, so farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear, farewell remorse. All good to me is lost. Evil be thou my good. Right? He's announcing the autonomous authority to pervert his heart, to decide what is the right, the good, and virtuous for himself, and to reject God and all such commandments. Right? That's the importance of that scene. So, section 3. So we're doing well. We're up to section 3. It's not that much longer, and we can have a conversation. Look at how many pages I put into section 4 and 5. Section 3 is called Killing Patients and Helping Patients Kill Themselves, some spiritual and practical realities. The spiritual harm to physicians who euthanize patients, who aid and abet patients in killing themselves, is significant, even if they themselves don't recognize it. These are not neutral choices. Right? That the patient desired or requested death as part of his medical care does not change the spiritual significance of the act. As I noted earlier, Christianity has always appreciated just how significantly murder as self-murder can sunder one's heart from its proper focus on God. Again, as to quote Engelhardt, he says, quote, "The traditional Christian life has always experienced such a death as a separation from the humility and the holiness of the life and death of Christ. This opposition to suicide, assisted suicide, and euthanasia is rooted in the experience of the Christian life as a life directed to humility," end quote. Assisted suicide and euthanasia involves the purposeful turning away from God, from the goodness of his gifts, where we should remember from 1 Corinthians, "Surely you know you are God's temple. The Spirit of God dwells. Anyone who destroys God's temple will himself be destroyed by God, but the temple of God is holy, and you are that temple," end quote. Death should be approached with humility and repentance, with prayer and confession. Willful killing of suffering or dying patients of oneself or others is rejected. Now, born with humility and with submission, however, suffering can aid in our struggle to craft a life turned wholeheartedly to God. St. John Chrysostom notes, quote, "So that I did not say rashly that these tribulations themselves mark out to us hopes of a resurrection. Who are tried the better, for he saith, as gold is tried in the furnace, so an acceptable man is the furnace of humiliation." Or as St. Mark the ascetic in 6th century argued, quote, "The mercy of God is hidden in sufferings, not of our choice. And if we accept such sufferings patiently, they bring us to repentance and deliver us from everlasting punishment," end quote. Now, please do not misunderstand me. Suffering is not intrinsically valuable. We do not desire suffering for its own sake. And without appropriate, proper spiritual guidance, it can be very, very trying and problematic. One needs a good spiritual father to help one orient through and work with issues associated with suffering. But approached properly with proper spiritual guidance, it can play an instrumental role in helping one develop one's self-discipline. Responding rightly to sickness and suffering, even to death, can help one accept God's will and to turn more fully to him. While the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," straightforwardly rules out euthanasia, the early canons of the Christian church also made clear that suicide was self-murder and thus similarly forbidden. Suicide even raised questions regarding the permissibility of providing the usual funeral offerings on behalf of the deceased. One might, if you're interested, check question 14 from the 18 canons of St. Timothy. One of the challenges is happening right now in Canada, for example, because it's part and parcel of the healthcare system, and because what doctors offer us, we assume must be good, otherwise why would a doctor offer it to us? What's happening with some of the churches is, Uncle Joe Bob will go off, have himself euthanized, the family comes back to the church, and the priest says, I can't do a funeral. It's absolutely forbidden. Because he committed suicide, which is absolutely forbidden. Okay? So it's really challenging, these kind of things. The central purpose of life here is to love and worship God. That's the central purpose. Suicide and euthanasia involve a purposely turning away from God. It sunders one from the Christian recognition of the need for humility and suffering and submission to God, even into death. But even in secular terms, physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia raise very serious questions. I mentioned, obviously, already Canada, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want you to think of the Netherlands here. They were early pioneers, quite literally, in this fashion. Patients 16 years of age or older may provide written or oral requests for medical termination. 16 years. I want you to remember back when you were 16. Physicians are supposed to ensure that the patient's request is well considered, voluntary, and that the patient is enduring unbearable suffering. Yet the meaning of these terms is immensely ambiguous. Individuals have requested euthanasia for alcoholism, mental health problems. If the patient is between 12 and 16, the Netherlands requires parental or guardian consent for euthanasia. For patients 16 or 17 years of age, the parents or guardians are, consulted, but parental consent isn't considered necessary. The Netherlands' willingness to euthanize 16-year-olds on their own authority raises serious questions regarding the ability of adolescents to make well-considered or voluntary decisions under such strong circumstance. Here, one might consider the well-documented scientific data demonstrating that the adolescent brain is still developing. It takes a very long time to develop the adolescent brain. You have the limbic system versus the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system develops really early on, right? It's the part of the brain, it's about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, all that kind of fun stuff. And the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, is the seat of executive function. It's the part of the brain that says, you need to study for that exam and not play the video games, right? You need to work on that philosophy paper rather than go hanging out with your buddies and eating pizza and things like that. It's the seat of executive function develops much later into the mid-20s. Right? So it takes a long time to learn how to really make adult judgments. Such psychological and physiological data indicates it's highly unlikely that adolescents are really in a mature enough position to provide adequately informed consent about life-ending medical care. Moreover, such laws typically frame the permissibility of these kinds of requests as falling within a sort of a limited set of physical and psychological criteria. So again, think of my good friend Joe Bob, right? And we say he's in horrible, intractable pain, and shouldn't somebody do something? And as we start to lay out those conditions, we create a subclass of individuals in our society who are told your life is worth ending, it's not worth living. We degrade the lives of sick, disabled, and dying patients. These policies straightforwardly inform specific groups of persons that their lives are not the sort of lives that one should they're the sort of lives that one should reasonably want to end. Policymakers, physicians, family members, and others are encouraged to think of these subclasses of persons as individuals who maybe even ought to be killed for their own benefit. That these lives are not worth living, and that perhaps it would be most appropriate to save the medical resources. The Canadian Supreme Court, for example, Carter v. Canada, framed its approval of euthanasia in terms of the patient's own experience of suffering. And they said, quote, when the person has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, that's an illness, a disease, a disability, that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individuals and the circumstances of his or her condition, end quote. Right? Notice how they have taken the permissibility of suicide and euthanasia and they've placed it totally into the subjective category of the person, and they don't even talk about being terminal or in the imminence of death like I was describing my good friend Joe Bob. Implementing this kind of legislation in the medical practice, however, distracts us from the importance of essential social investment in effective palliative medicine and social and spiritual care for the dying. Autonomy-based arguments like this, when we really focus on autonomy, which the Canadian Supreme Court did, grounds the justification for these kinds of practices in what is supposedly individual free choice. But this tends to isolate persons from each other, refusing adequately to appreciate our deep social connectedness, and insisting on individual decisions often isolated from the undue influence of others, and insisting on individual decisions isolated while also failing to recognize the ways in which patients are socially accepted socially conditioned to accept this as if it were medical care. Once it's part and parcel of the background culture, once it's normalized, we start looking at it and we say, well, that's an acceptable medical thing to do, therefore I ought to do it also. Uncle Joe Bob did it, why shouldn't I do it under these kinds of circumstances? It begins to corrupt in all kinds of ways. It starts to look like medical care. And it can become tempting to encourage elderly and seriously ill patients towards inexpensive medical termination. After all, the reasons given to justify such practices do so by characterizing that life as irremediably wretched. It's worth puzzling, for example, about whether the high costs of single-payer healthcare in Canada have led to restrictions on palliative, rehabilitative, psychological, and social services, such that medical termination of patients has become a cost-saving substitute for medical care. I don't know that for certain, but it is interesting because it is much, much cheaper to do this than it is to treat people for cancer and for end-of-life, other forms of later life, end-of-life care. There's even one case which was very depressing, which involved a relatively young woman who'd been in, I think it was the Canadian Marines or their equivalent, and she had been injured in an accident, was in a wheelchair. You've seen this article, yeah, absolutely. And she had been trying to get the Canadian healthcare system to help her build a ramp to get in and out of her home with the wheelchair. And they had ignored her, denied her, ignored her, until finally they sent her a letter and they said, "Madam, if your life bothers you so much, here's how you sign up for euthanasia." Encouraging patients to die earlier without all these extensive treatments and costs surely saves significant economic resources. Now, please note, as I said before, I do not have such evidence, nor am I really making any accusations. However, I challenge all of you who are familiar with these practices in places like Canada, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and so forth, to take a closer look. I would love to work with a really good economist who could really crunch the numbers and help us see how much money is being saved, if any, with this immense shift in that direction. That would be really, really interesting to explore, analyze, and document. Health Canada is really good about bragging about their numbers, but they don't track the savings rate. And I don't know if they do it on purpose, they never thought about it, or they're embarrassed by it. I just don't know. And again, Canada's euthanasia statistics are, from a certain perspective, impressive. They only legalized medical assistance in dying on June 17th, 2016. It hasn't been that long. By the time you get to 2023, it was up to 4.5% approximately of all deaths. I do not know 2024's data yet because it's always a little bit behind, and we won't get 2025 data for another year or so to see where things are. But I do know from my colleagues in Canada who are really activists in this process, one of their challenges is finding enough doctors to take care of the patients who want to be euthanized. Okay, so it's a really interesting, in a horrible fashion, set of things that's taking place, right? Because it's anticipated to increase. Health Canada reports, as I noted earlier, that, and again, I just quote them now, that the most commonly cited intolerable physical or psychological suffering reported by patients was the loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities. That's 85%. Following closely by the loss of ability to perform activities of daily living, 81%. Right? So not even focusing so much on pain and suffering, but on the loss of the ability to engage in autonomy, the loss of, and one wonders, where is the connectedness with family, with friends, with medical care workers who would otherwise be there trying to support and help them. As noted, having a fatal illness, terminal diagnosis, or even being significant physical pain is not always required to be eligible for medical termination. The Netherlands accepts euthanasia for psychiatric cases, despite the challenges of determining when a psychiatric patient really fulfills the requirements of having made a voluntary and well-considered decision. In one reported case, a healthy woman was euthanized whose diagnosis was, quote, prolonged grief disorder. Because her husband had died 12 months prior, she was still sad, and so she had herself euthanized. Once one has accepted the centrality of patient autonomy for defining things like permissible medical choice, just like with issues of sexual activity, right? It just becomes the patient's individual subjective experiences, interests, and choices that do all the moral heavy lifting. The value of human life has been reduced to no more than the value that individuals give their lives. Consequently, in the secular world, in so many of these places, provided that there's some sense in which they can say it was freely chosen, there's little reason to believe that euthanasia and assisted suicide ought to regard dying patients who are suffering at the end of life. The Joe Bob case it's there. Not that we should kill Joe Bob. We should know better than that as Christians, but it's there, but it's not. There's so many other cases that exist and are easy to document. Once the focal point of human life becomes autonomous self-determination, when we reflect on the sparse value commitments in the secular world, when we reject traditional religious prohibitions against murder and self-murder, embracing instead personal choices of life and death, it's easy to see why one might move in this direction. And here recognize that terminology is not neutral. People are choosing terminology in a way designed to shift and shape expectations and understandings. Language always draws out moral understandings and orients users towards ethical or spiritual understandings. When we have terminological distinctions, we're giving expression to ways in which we shape the moral life world, ways in which we look at the moral world and we understand the moral world. So when we refer to euthanasia and assisted suicide as death with dignity, right, or medical assistance in dying, rather than murder or assistance with self-murder, what we're indicating is a significant shift in underlying cultural understandings. Describing the practice of deliberately ending the lives of patients as medical treatment or as providing a dignified death rhetorically conveys the permissibility of all these choices. As I noted earlier, this language, medical assistance in dying, is strategic. It's designed to assimilate the killing of patients into the everyday practice of medicine. Management of pain, the symptoms, together with medical assistance for nutrition and hydration, are all central elements of typical end-of-life care. And we want those, right? We want pain management. We want nutrition, hydration. We want these kinds of things. And highly vulnerable patients here who request or are manipulated into accepting medical assistance in dying may never realize that it encompasses euthanasia. Right? Big shift. In short, what's happened in the secular world is the significance of taking human life has been deeply blunted, if not fully lost. It's hard for people to see anymore. Death is no longer appreciated as subject to the will of God or as requiring careful spiritual preparation. Rather, it's just another event subject to human mastery. Instead of working to alleviate physical pain or reaching out in love to ameliorate emotional, psychological anxiety, depression, despair, family members, friends, and physicians are simply to help the patient die. This colleague I know in Canada who carries these things out describes in glowing details setting things up. I always use next week Tuesday, but it's not because I hate Tuesday, it's just it's a useful time. But so next week Tuesday happens, they wheel the patient in, harder to say no under those circumstances, I guess. I don't know, but they bring them in. The family is there. They've been sort of prepped in advance. Everyone says goodbye. They kiss, they hug. The physician inserts the overdose, and the patient dies. In the end, these practices corrupt physicians and other healthcare workers into the practice of killing patients under the guise of doing good. Yet this is a reality that so many in the bioethics world, in the secular world, cannot comprehend. Right? I'm not saying everyone has shifted that way, but it's so hard for so many people to see it anymore. After all, without God, there's no reason necessarily to believe that actively or passively killing a person with that person's consent is morally problematic. The long-term impact on medicine as it continues to accept intentionally ending the lives of patients as part of its professional mores, I think, will be significant. It's just going to change over time, and it's going to ever more shift the kinds of relationships we have with doctors, they have with us, and the way in which we make decisions. So you've done a wonderful job. We're at the very last section, just some concluding thoughts, and then we can have a conversation. I'm going to start with a quote from Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. Somebody's read The Brothers Karamazov. Willing to acknowledge having suffered through the both times. One of my absolute favorite books, right? He says, quote, for those who renounce Christianity and rebel against it, are in their essence of the same image of the same Christ, and such they remain. For until now, neither their wisdom nor the ardor of their hearts has been able to create another, higher image of God and his dignity than the image shown of old by Christ. And whatever their attempts, the results have been only monstrosities. Right? Dostoevsky's reflections here on the implications of morality without God get right to the heart of the matter. Once we don't have God, once we no longer have a way of talking about truth in itself, about issues of morality, we do violence in the name of all kinds of things, including equality, social justice, and political power. And that's been amazingly significant. R.J. Rummel documents some 62 million murdered by the Soviet state, some 35.5 million murdered by the communist Chinese, some 21 million murdered by the Nazi regime, and some 2 million murdered by the Khmer Rouge, just to name a few small instances in an attempt to create a particular account of the good in the world, but without God. The Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C. documents the killing of more than 100 million people by communist regimes and their attempts to bring about an equalitarian society and workers' rights. As the examples of euthanasia and assisted suicide practices illustrates, the results of rejecting God, of choosing to give meaning and sense to the world ourselves. This is what Dostoevsky is worrying about, right? Now includes the dehumanization of entire classes of persons who are told as a matter of public policy, your life is not worth living. Let us help you end your life because it's not worth having anymore. As indicated, such policy works. The number of such active medical killings continues to increase. As Dostoevsky writes and notes, the results have very often been monstrous indeed. Reference to God, such as traditional Christianity provides a normative position, grounding how all of morality ought to be understood, as well as how and why one ought to act on considerations of moral rationality. Provides a perspective necessary to invoke the idea of unconditioned moral truth, for undoing the Gordian knot of moral pluralism, because there's only one God, and he commands, and our job is to know him. Without God, routinely, there's just an irresolvable tension between moral rationality and prudential rationality. Why should rational actors follow the requirements of some impartial morality instead of important personal or family-oriented concerns? If moral reality does not come from God, who also acts as the guarantor that the virtuous are rewarded and the vicious punished, it's unclear one why ought to follow an impartial morality at all, once it no longer serves one's own prudential purposes. After all, without God, the universe is ultimately meaningless. We come from nowhere, we're going nowhere, and we're not doing it for any particular purpose. It just is. Its very essence is ineffable. It means nothing. Right? Even those acts that some deem right, good, and virtuous or just will in the end always be lost and forgotten in that empty, godless universe. Christianity, in contrast, offers the unification of the genesis and justification of morality. It provides the motivation to be moral, and it helps us come to understand and to love the one who is. Right? Which is why we remember Christ is risen. Deity is risen. Y'all, thank you so much. Happy to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Well,
Please, yes.
I got a question. I'm Canadian, and it made me very angry listening, sad and angry. What motivates someone, a doctor, to do that? Because as a human being, I can't see any reason to kill someone. How can a doctor who takes an oath, and they are socialized medicine, so are they paid the same way? I mean, I thought they were all paid through the government.
To the best of my
What
knowledge, that's
motivates
true.
them to do something like that?
I'll give you the best I can,
Yeah.
coming from, not defending, but trying to come from the people who wrote about it. And I'm happy to send Clint Parker these citations if you really want to see what they had to say about themselves, because they're really enthusiastic about it, right? And what motivates some of them is the sense in which they really do have had dealt with patients like Joe Bob, and they're really worried about those kinds of prolonged suffering. Now, why one doesn't do good palliative medicine, interesting question. Why one doesn't try to connect people back with family and so forth is an interesting question. But yeah, absolutely. But part of what happens also is what my diagnosis would be that they've moved further away from a traditional Christian world, and so really can't see it anymore. So instead of just sort of saying shame on you exactly, it's more a way of saying it's really, really sad because one can't see it anymore. It's almost like a psychological gestalt shift where one can't experience the harm that's taking place in that fashion because they no longer experience God, they no longer live a kind of a traditional sort of cultural life, and so it becomes very difficult for them to see what could possibly be wrong with it. And so every year when I see them, boy, they are enthusiastic at ASPH to promote the additional number of to spread out the number of patients who are involved. Some of them are working really aggressively to push the age of consent down in Canada, so it can be requested by 15, 16-year-olds, maybe with, maybe without patient parents' permission. So it's really fascinating to see in this fashion. I mean, another sort of interesting twist here, which is quite important, is so California legalized assisted suicide at the same time, about the same time that Canada legalized active euthanasia. And what's fascinating is how many cases a year happen in Canada and how few cases a year happen in California. Now, there are some cases in California. It's not saying it's not happening, but it's big, much, much bigger in Canada. And I think, I don't know for certain, it's me projecting a sense of what's taking place, that part of what happens with assisted suicide, not justifying it, but sort of try to explain what's going on, is sometimes patients want the security of the overdose. And so the doctor prescribes it for them, gives it to them, and they put it on the mantelpiece. And it sits there. And it's there. And you hope they never use it, right? On the other hand, when it's part and parcel of the medical care, that's why it's so important to see how radically this shifts medical care. Because when it's part and parcel of medical care, what happens is the doctors are not simply writing the script you take home and you take at some point on yourself, but rather it is about they wheel you in. They set everything up. They talk to the family. It now becomes an event, right? That's psychologically difficult to step away from, right? Very hard. So a number of pieces there that are really quite challenging and puzzling in terms of the cultural shift.
Also in Canada, it's a very long wait to get into any kind of specialist.
Yep.
Extremely long.
Yep.
So when you're sick, you are waiting a long time. So do they get in quicker to these doctors?
To my knowledge, yes, but I don't know how. And they were trying to get but I don't know for certain. I do know they were working to get the waiting period down from 10 days to only a few days. Instead of a waiting, for a while you had to request and then wait and then request again, and now they were trying to get that down and not know exactly where the current law is. I'm not a philosopher, I don't know, but it's shifting. One interesting place to look at for the waiting list, for people who are interested in the Canadian waiting list, is the Fraser Institute. Do you know the Fraser Institute? Well, they're a think tank in Canada, and one of the things that they do is they track how long people wait for various types of treatments. And some of it is very depressing. Yeah, very, very depressing.
I've heard a lot about it.
Yep. Please.
You contrast what the Christian knows with the pluralism of competing secular approaches. But it seems to me there's a pluralism within Christianity, sects of Christianity, and disagreements about moral issues among Christians, probably in this room, about capital punishment, suicide, sexual morality. What do you make of that?
Oh, there are multiple Christian religions, and they have different accounts of who God is and how He commands and how one functions. Sure, that's why I don't use the term Christianity in a general broad sense, but rather in a traditional sense. So as best as I can, I'm trying to explain to you how Orthodox Christianity approaches these issues. I would not suggest that there aren't, brawls inside Orthodox Christianity either, but we have ways of trying to approach and resolve things in this fashion which are deeply embedded in the saints and in the traditional practices of the church. And it's not a philosophical approach. It's an epistemology that's embedded in liturgy. So the way one comes to know is by standing in God's presence, facing the correct way, and praying properly. So it's a very experiential. And so when one really wants to know things, one goes and finds holy elders, people who really are like saints. It's a different world as best I can. As a trained philosopher, as somebody who makes my living as a philosopher, it's a radically different sort of a world. So it's difficult for me to express, and I'm not going to pretend I'm terribly good at it. Just do the best I can expressing it. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are surely multiple Christian responses, and depending on which Christian religion one belongs to, more traditional, more conservative ones versus more liberal ones, you're going to find a variety of perspectives. I don't endorse those. I'm trying to express this very particular one that comes right out of ancient Christianity, of Orthodoxy. Yeah, but very good point. Sure. Please, yes.
So hi, I want to thank you first of all for raising some very important philosophical questions around the whole process of what's going on in Canada, euthanasia versus assisted suicide. But just as a historian, I have a little bit of a hard time making the connection of how you suggest that a Christian worldview is the solution, but there are very many non-Christian nations who have prohibitions on these practices, and even obviously Canada up until 2016. So I'm wondering how your critique of secular or humanist philosophies would deal with the fact that somehow various countries have developed strong prohibitions against assisted suicide over centuries.
Sure. So in Canada, not Canada, China. I go to China about once a year. Work with some wonderful folks from Inner Mongolia and other places, Shanghai and Hong Kong, things like this. And they're not Christians. They're pagans of various sorts, Confucians and so forth. He describes himself quite openly as a Confucian pagan. And one of the challenges they've had in China, for example, fairly recently, has been a greatly increased rate of elder suicide. Okay. And I've asked him about that. I said, "How do you understand that?" Because I'm not a Confucian. He's tried for almost 30 years now to teach me what it is to be a good Confucian, and I failed. I really don't understand it. And he's told me, he said, "Well, it's a shame." I said, "Well, what do you mean? That's not saying much." He says, "I understand, but that's kind of the best we can say." He is against assisted suicide, euthanasia. He thinks it's a shame, and exactly how to express that in an aggressive fashion is, the case. That other religions and cultures would come to a similar conclusion, I think is wonderful and good. I surely think everyone should convert and come to know the one true God. I mean, I'm after all a Christian, and I know that God lives. And so it's not, I can surely describe in that fashion, just as you did, quite rightly, that different different places in the world have come to similar conclusions. And I can applaud that and think this is a wonderful and good thing. At the same time, I really hope that they would come to know who God is and why he lives and how we ought to, in fact, orient towards him. So it's a kind of a both-and answer as best I can, but your description is not even remotely wrong. It's seen in different ways, different parts of the world. Japan has a long history of honorable suicide, for example. So different religions and cultures, different parts of the world have dealt with these kinds of things in very different ways. Some that overlap with what we might think of as Christian, others not so much, often with different kinds of reasons underlying them, and so forth. Yeah. A student has to ask a question. Sorry, but we'll get Professor Mosley in a minute. Student has to ask a question, please.
Well, still not really a student. I'm going back to May. But a lot of what is talked about, or what you talked about with elective euthanasia, seems more from a psychological standpoint. And physiologically, if a body or someone's body is no longer able to support its life, obviously palliative. I work in the emergency department and see a lot of trauma and things that come in. At what point, when a body has, or when a person has endured trauma and the body cannot sustain itself anymore, at a certain point, when we're coding a patient or we're providing care, at some point a physician may have to make that decision where care is withdrawn.
Sure.
As a Christian, where
So
should our standpoint on that?
let me ask you a serious question. There is a commandment that says, thou shalt not, something that's relevant to what we're talking about. Thou shalt not kill. It's not thou shalt always save. That's actually a really important distinction. Nor is it thou shalt attempt to live forever. In fact, we're not supposed to attempt to live forever. It's not all of these other things. Instead, it's thou shalt not kill. Now, it can make perfect sense to say, Doc, I've had enough medicine. Leave me alone. Call the priest, okay, or your pastor. For me, I've already been working with my priest on a routine basis, even to get to that point. He'd be visiting me routinely, confessing me, and all kinds of things, bringing the communion, all, sacraments, all these things. And as a result, what would be happening is he would be helping me think about at what moment to say, enough. Give up the wonders and goods of this world, and instead move on to Jesus. That's a hard decision to make. This world is a wonderful place, and people hold on to it really tightly. But it can be really important to step back from that and say, enough. But recognize that's not killing somebody unless one is actually trying to kill the person. It's a recognition it's no longer an appropriate thing to do, right, to attempt to save this patient under these kinds of circumstances. And doctors have to work this out with patients, they have to work this out with families, and you can have somewhat different responses in different kinds of cases. And also, I always recommend to doctors that they be careful what they offer to patients. Because again, what doctors offer to patients, patients assume are good. Otherwise, why would you offer it? Right? So imagine you have a patient, and do you ever work in the ER? You could pretend. Okay, so let's imagine we have a patient in Professor Parker's ER, and he has end-stage prostate cancer, and it's metastasized. Right, it's all up and down. It's got mets all up and down his ribs. It's going to be, he's dying. And you go up to him and you offer, you say, if you go into your heart stops beating, should we do CPR? Well, you offered him CPR. You're a doctor. It must be a positive good. Why would you do that, right? Instead, you go up to him and say something quite different. Maybe you say, and the doctors have to fix it if I've gotten it wrong. Maybe you say to the patient, you say, look, let me explain to you about the cancer. Let me explain to you about the damage to your ribs, everything else. And that if your heart stops beating, if we attempt to do CPR, you're just going to get to experience the pain of a flailed chest before you die anyway. I don't want to do that to you. I don't want to do that. Now we have a totally different kind of conversation. Right? And those kinds of things can be very important, to have conversations in a different kind of a way. Routinely, when I do ethics consults, I ask people, do you have a pastor whom you trust to come in and talk with you and work with you on this very, very hard case that's happening? There'll be a baby dying or mom dying. I mean, these are traumatic times, and people need people they trust to come in and guide them through. And it's not that I agree with all the different pastors. As I said, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I think everyone should convert. That's easy. But at the same time, I recognize not everybody will and not everybody does. And people do have pastors whom they trust. And if those people can help them, this is a good, right? And make that really hard judgment about when it's time to say, enough. This has been a wonderful life. It's also a good conversation to have with parents and with grandparents. It's a hard conversation to have. My father, who is now 81, I think, he and I have sat down and had long conversations about this. He's told me what he wants to have under what circumstances. He knows what he considers to be really inappropriate, excessive care, and how to sort of explain it through. And he talks with me because it's so much easier to talk with me than his wife, my mother, right? And so I try to play this kind of a role as best I can. Now, my mother knows also, but it's a hard conversation to have. I recommend people of every age have these kind of hard conversations. I surely have had them, and I'm much younger than my father, with my wife, and it's a hard kind of conversation. But with my priest also, and these kinds of things. Yeah, professor. Sorry, and then another student. We'll pick on another random student.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is, and thank you for bringing the broader awareness of the MAID laws in Canada. And I read a recent survey, it was conducted by Scott Kim, who did a large, very representative survey of Canadian opinion on their views about the new MAID laws. And 70% of people in Canada support the current MAID laws.
Could you do me a giant favor and send me the citation for it? I'd love to see it. I really would. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And he also looks at the reasons that were given in support of it, and it was over 90% said it was to promote patient autonomy. And so I was just sort of wondering, you said you kind of wear the radical libertarian hat on one hand, and you wear the orthodox Christian hat on the other. And I was wondering, though, I could see a very strong libertarian argument given for this being a good thing, right? It's promoting voluntary transactions that people mutually agree upon, and that they find to be promoting what the person wants. They've made their own decision that they want to end their life, and now they've found someone who will voluntarily help them out, either prescribing them pills or giving them a lethal injection.
Up until 1972, it was not illegal in Texas to aid and abet suicide. It was not illegal in Texas to aid and abet suicide up until 1972, right about that time. It was never held to be good. It was never held to be virtuous. It was never held to be the kind of thing that we promote because of autonomy, right? Because I don't accept autonomy as a positive value. Texas looked at it as you're free, and you're free to make choices, and whatever your free choices to make, even if they're the ones that send you to hell, well, you're free to ask other people to help you with. And the idea was that the state should, by and large, sort of stay out of these things. Now, so in general, my libertarian hat on, I tend to think in those terms. It's not that I think what people are doing is good. It's not that I think what they're doing is virtuous. But rather that insofar, in a general secular fashion, people are simply engaging with each other, and it's just and free and consenting, and there's no taxpayer financing, and no doctors ever being required to participate under these circumstances. It's unclear to me why the state's involved. However, I'll shift it just a little bit. Texas made no view at all about this having anything to do with doctors. It was not, notice I didn't say up until 72 they had physician-assisted suicide, or instead it was simply aiding and abetting suicide. They made no judgments. They just stayed out of it. They said, why involve the medical profession? Why not have lawyer-assisted suicide? They don't take the oath about first doing no harm. Or philosopher-assisted suicide. You get a really cool lecture, and then you drink the hemlock. I don't know. They just left it out. Now, Texas, again, never thought of this as good, right? Instead, it was simply an issue. If you through freedom want to send yourself to hell by committing suicide, you can have somebody help you do it. And a number of interesting cases in the case law that I won't bore people with on that particular point. Now, just so you know, because Texas is an odd place, you probably have that general prejudice anyway. But when Texas changed its law, I think in response to pressure from the Americans, it rewrote it in a really odd way. It said that it was illegal to aid and abet suicide. However, in an emergency circumstance, you could use up to and including deadly force to prevent someone from committing suicide. Now, I've never been able to wrap my mind around that particular set of clauses. It's just so strange. But there are all kinds of elements of Texas law that bear that kind of interesting sort of puzzle. But that's in a sort of more Texan humorous sense, that's how I would approach it. It's not about affirming it as good, not even remotely. And I definitely don't want taxpayer financing, because that means I got to pay for it, and I don't want to be paying for these kind of things. And I don't want any doctor being required to have to participate as a matter of the government or anybody else, much less being required to refer. So unless somebody signs a contract saying I'm going to be a euthanizer, I want them out. I want them free to walk away. Now, again, I say all of this without any suggestion at all that I think the practice is good. It's just simply in a general secular way. Without God, it's really hard for people to know differently. Yeah. But yeah, other questions? We were picking on students. Sorry, I teach undergraduates, so that's fine. Please.
Thank you for the lecture. So something I noticed like on the lecture was like when you're talking about, you kind of had like different perspectives. Like you definitely began with like the orthodox perspective, and so we could look at this also like kind of like the secular arguments. And so like I saw that like there's like in like your main like argument against euthanasia, but there's a lot of the orthodox presuppositions. And like I'm just wondering like how when you're interacting and engaging with other thinkers who don't have the same presuppositions, do you still talk in the same way, or like how does that come into play?
I mean, those who have argued with me for years can say better than I probably, but I try to do sort of two things. First thing I try to do is show them that philosophical secular reason doesn't get them the results they think it gets them. Instead, it leads to very little other than something like a libertarian account where one consents into practices. And then at the same time, I'm always running a separate set of arguments, not always in the same paper, but the same separate set of arguments about why one really needs to learn how to turn to God properly and understand the deep evil of what's going on in these practices. Because it's a deep evil that I can attempt to sort of describe to people as best I can, but for so many, it'll be like talking gibberish unless they step into the practice, step into liturgy, step into the prayers, and orient, and then they'll know. Things will change, right? And so the best I can really do on a regular basis, because Orthodoxy is not philosophical, I can rhetorically sort of describe it and explain and go through the history of Christianity and things like this, but until one changes one's heart, steps into the practice and learns to stand and face God in the right direction, it's hard to know. So I'll give you a bad analogy as best I can. Every now and then, some of my students want to write papers about how best to raise children. And I say things like, how many kids have you got? They say, well, none. Okay, well, how many kids have you raised? Well, none. How many kids? So how do you know what's the best way to raise children? Until you step into the practice of raising children, the best you can do is read books about it. But until you're encountering this particular little kid right here, it is hard to understand because kids are particular. They're individuals. They don't read developmental manuals. And they don't all care about, I had 3 sons. One son, the worst thing you could ever possibly do was put him in timeout. He's got toys there. We're 2 feet away. But he's like, how dare you abandon me? Kid number 2, put him in timeout. He's like, cool. How long do I get to be here? Half an hour, did you say? Oh, this is excellent. No one's going to bother me, right? And it was just like this. It was totally useless, right? He was the same kid who thought it was a wonderful time to sort of climb underneath kitchen cabinets, close the door, and then you go find him. He's lost. What has happened to Thaddeus? He's gone. Well, he timed out himself all the time. And so, reading the manuals are useful. It's sort of like reading church history is useful. But until you step into the practice, it's hard to know. Right? Until you really know the individual, it's hard to know. Right? Another analogy is sort of like, what is it like to be married? Well, you can describe that. You can read marriage manuals, things like this. But until you're married to a very particular person and you realize who that person is and you try to interact with that person in a very specific way, right, it's really hard to understand what it is to be married. And philosophy don't help that much. These poor unfortunate gentlemen heard the same story earlier, but I'll try to give it as advice for people who might one day get married. Don't use philosophy to help you. Okay? It goes like this. My wife and I had been married for about a month. I was in graduate school. I was working 23 hours a day. I was almost never home. I was living, drinking, sleeping, eating philosophy all the time. One day, we got together, we were going to have a dinner together, we carved out time, she lit the candles and the candlesticks I had not yet broken because she had learned that her husband was clumsy and hiding everything. So we lit the candles, we put the food out, and she says, and we're eating, and she says to me, looking lovingly at me, "Do you love me as much as I love you?" I stopped. I thought about that. I said, wow. Such an interesting question. I do believe you exist, even though I don't think I can prove the existence of other minds. And I'm not sure what love really is, but I'm pretty sure I love you. I think I know what I think that means, maybe. And I don't know how to adjudicate amongst different minds to account for it. So I guess I have to say I don't know. Now, she had left long before. I hadn't really noticed, deep in philosophy note, right? And I went back to work. And about a week and a half later, I discovered she wasn't talking to me. And I sort of went up to her, I said, "So what have I done? What's happened?" And she explained. I said, "Oh, what was the right answer?" It turns out, I was working all the time, I was never home. We were newlyweds. She wanted me to look at her and say, "Yes," or "No, I love you more." Anything that would affirm this relationship that we have. Anything but a silly philosophical answer. And all the women are nodding their heads like, "Yeah, you dummy." "Yeah, of course." Right? Okay. And I know that now. I've been married more than 30 years. She's put up with me a very long time at this point. But it's a challenging thing to try to approach a relationship with somebody, a particular person, philosophically. Right? It's not that you turn off your brain. You do have to reason and think about people. Even your spouse, you do have to reason and think about them. But the one thing you really, really have to do is go talk to them. Right? And I tell you all of that silly story to get to the final point. You've got to go talk to God and know who He is and speak to Him properly and be open to listen. Otherwise, how will one know who He is? Yeah.
Thank you.
Please, yes.
I have a question on regards of from not the medical side, but from the family side. When you're the one suffering is one thing. When you see a loved one suffering, is another type of
Really,
suffering.
really, really hard. Yeah.
So how do we think of that?
First to say, just it is really, really hard. Having gone through these kinds of, it's very, very hard. I do think people need, in all seriousness, very important pastoral support. They need other family members to be there. They need an interaction of brothers and sisters and aunts. They need, especially if you've got a good family, to really help you through these kinds of things. Recognizing again in the end that there are things one can do and things one can't do, and also to help you make hard decisions about things. So my father-in-law died a few years ago, and he had Parkinson's, amongst other things. And what really helped my wife was working with her brother and with her mother while he was, in the hospital, to make the decision, to move to care that was more appropriate for the end of life, where they weren't trying to say it's time to kill him, anything like that. It was a way in which they could reach out and love and do the very best they could, recognizing that you sometimes have to live through and work through those kinds of really, really traumatic circumstances. Good pastor is immensely important insofar as one has one. It's good to have good family members to work with. I don't mean to minimize any of that, even a little bit. It can be very, very challenging. One case I was involved in at the hospital, with 3 sisters who were sort of fighting about how best to take care of their mother, who had said, I don't know which Protestant denomination, but she was a Bible-believing Christian. The mother had said, I don't, please take care of me. and don't let me die. Really sort of do everything possible kind of discussion. But it was becoming very clear she was coming to the end of things, and the sisters were sort of fighting about it. And we suggested actually that they go in and talk to their mother. And the response of some of the people was a little bit odd. They said, "What do you mean go talk to her mother? Because the mother was unconscious. How is mom going to respond?" And the answer is, well, maybe, just as she's unconscious doesn't mean she's not listening, doesn't mean that she's not engaging in some spiritual fashion with her daughters. And if their daughters would go in there and talk with each other and ask mom, what does mom really want us to do? Especially if they have somebody pastorally whom they trust, that might help them work through the trauma and the choice to make under those kind of circumstances. And it was simply a practical suggestion, and the Orthodox priests I work with operate under the assumption that the person is there, the person's listening, the person is with Christ but not yet with Christ fully, and it's worth talking to them and saying to them, maybe it's time to go be with Christ rather than to be here, and maybe it would be useful to help your family make these kind of hard decisions, right? And the priests I work with tell me how important that kind of conversation is, because they think of dying as in part an active sort of process where people in part have to choose to give up the wonders and goods of this life, and how hard that can be. And so having those kinds of conversations, I think is very important. I think it's again, family structure is very important, so far as one has good family structures, close friends, pastoral care. All of those kinds of things can be really key to help one through these kinds of very, very difficult. I've been through it more than once, and it's just, it's traumatizing. Yeah. So you had a question over here first?
I haven't even raised my hand yet, have you?
Are you volunteering people?
She was poking it up.
Okay, yes.
If you don't mind, kind of shifting back to the advanced directive question.
Sure.
I work in a skilled nursing facility,
Mhm.
and so I oftentimes have the opportunity to kind of accidentally hear these conversations where they're talking with patients about it, those who are able to make the decision on their own. And I was just wondering if you could shed some of your expertise on that decision-making process, because I was recently speaking with a patient who, early stages of dementia, was doing some counseling with her surrounding her memory loss and recent language changes. And she was sharing with me a lot of the feelings that you were saying that you're seeing in these patients who are electing for the medicated assisted suicide, of feelings of being a burden to others, less enjoyment with life, but she's still pretty independent with a lot of those ADLs and things. So I guess if you could just shed some light on that morality principle when it comes to those advanced directive decisions, when you have those who are providing counseling who maybe don't have the full medical picture, or who have selfish motives, like those family members who were advising her to have the DNR order, and she told me to my face that she did not want that, even though she signed it for the family members.
Didn't want to be a burden to others in that, or didn't want to upset the family members in some fashion. Yeah, that's hard. So I don't know if I have any sage advice other than, advanced directives can be an important tool, but you have to use them very, very carefully. So you don't agree to things that you don't want, and that you actually express to family members very carefully what you do want. Like my conversation, what I said earlier about my conversation with my father. Right? Those are serious, hard conversations to have with your father. And it's not so much about filling out the paperwork as making it clear to someone he knows will help my mother at the end what is he wants, what kinds of care he wants, what kinds of care he doesn't want, and how he wants to sort of approach these kinds of things. And documenting that as best you can be very helpful. It can also be immensely helpful to make sure you have the right decision maker chosen. someone who will stand up to those kinds of manipulations and who will also make sure that what you are looking for spiritually and so forth actually gets carried out. It's important to do these things carefully. So one of my colleagues, his mother was dying, and he is the youngest of 6, but he was the one who was the appointed decision maker, because he was the one that his mother trusted to make the right kinds of decisions for her that she had talked to. It became a real challenge because my friend lives in Austin, his mother was in Arizona, and one of his older brothers was living with his mother. He thought he was the one who should be making decisions. After all, he lived with his mother. And so it became very important for this friend of mine to call the doctors at the hospital and say, I have the durable power of attorney for healthcare. Let me send it to you. Happy to let you talk to my brothers and sisters, but please make sure I make the decisions, because that's my mother and I had long conversations about what she really wants, and I'm the one who interprets what it says on the power of attorney, the advance directive, to make sure that I really try to produce the kinds of outcomes and care for and love for my mother as she wanted it to be done. And that's why we had the conversations. That became important. So choosing somebody who shares, knows who you are, shares your religious, spiritual sort of understandings of things, and really tries to help you work through these things to be very important also. And making sure that's the person who's appointed to make decisions. After that, real important to document things carefully. And insofar as you're in a case like that, where just because it's in writing doesn't mean the person can't undo it. Right? I was talking to Professor Parker earlier. Patients can tell doctors they've changed their mind, and ask the doctors to document that they've changed their mind, and write out really carefully. I don't know what would be the best form in here to do that for. But in Texas, it would be pretty typical to write it into the chart, something like that. Try to bring the family, maybe if appropriate, not always appropriate, right? Not pretend all families are perfect, right? Because they're not. But the idea is, if needed to, and if it was appropriate, to bring people into conversation about these kinds of things. So I know that's not perfect, but yeah, those kind of things can be really challenging. And so try to, being honest, try to have the conversations, have the knowledge to help people move forward. So that's right. Thank you so. Now you had your question?
Sure. So following your undergrads who want to write about parenting, and,
yeah, right.
And the caution is you have no experiences. So as a pastor, I haven't died. I have experienced Christ. I know that side, but I don't necessarily know the secular side from an experiential standpoint. So how do you have the right to speak on something you have not participated in, have no first-hand knowledge of? Are you just shifting perspectives?
So I can't answer for you. I will tell you what my priest would do as best as I understand it. My priest would sit with the person and talk to them about this life and the next, and would engage in extended prayer about this, and would try to help the person come to think carefully about maybe you're not ready to go to the next life. Maybe we still have spiritual work to do here. Or maybe it really is time to move, and to help the person be thinking through those kinds of cases. Because sometimes patients need to stay for very important spiritual work still before going. But it can also be the other. So it's a very kind of, so I'll give you just one, maybe two examples.
More so on somebody wants to actively kill themselves.
Oh.
Somebody is seeking relief, they're asking for, physician-assisted suicide, or if I were in Canada, how would I have this conversation with somebody?
So again, best I can do is tell you my understanding of what my priest would try to do is try to explain to the person, this is not how Christians die. This is not how any, in the history of Christianity, the saints have died. They accepted being killed, they accepted torture and suffering, things like that. But they have not gone and asked, engaged in actually killing themselves, or having people kill them, especially not under the circumstances of the fact that I'm suffering, please kill me so I don't suffer. And it would explain that the reason we have the saints, in part because they are with God and participating in the creative energies of God, at the same time that what's happening is they're showing us a kind of a life and a kind of a death that we're supposed to work emulate. Not that I'm particularly good at it, but the idea is we're supposed to emulate and look at. And part of the idea of looking at those and emulating those is to say that the best examples we have are the fallen, and the best examples we have do not tell you this is really a good way to do things. But it's still at the same time approach it with immense amounts of prayer, immense amount of talking with the person, lots of spiritual counseling, lots of confession, things of this nature. But I do know it is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. I had a very interesting conversation with another philosopher who's an Orthodox Christian in Canada in a particular parish, and I asked him what are the implications of what's happening with assisted suicide euthanasia in Canada for your parish. And he said much what I described earlier, with the sense of people don't know it's bad, partly because probably they haven't really been told by the pulpit that this is a bad thing to do, right? The wrong way of approaching death. And he thought there was a burden on the priest to do a much better job explaining it. But at the same time, it was one of these things where because doctors are offering it, it seems good. It seems, why would a doctor offer me something if it isn't morally acceptable, if it isn't reasonable? It's like, and it's legal, it must be acceptable. Those kinds of things. And so it's a shift in the normativity of one's experience in the world, and so it becomes harder and harder for them to see until they've done it. And then the priest can't do anything, right? Other than tell the family, look, I can pray with you, but I can't do the traditional funeral services precisely because he rejected at the very end. And I can pray that God will be merciful on him and take care of him and love him. But there are things I can't do now. Not easy. Yeah. I don't envy you, by the way. I mean, pastors, I think, have a very, very hard job. So philosophers can be silly at times and explain things like this, but at the same time, I do the best I can, but I don't have to do those really hard conversations with families of the sort that you have to. So yeah, that's a challenge. Please.
Not a question, just along those lines, and a tool that can be used, just because I've only recently just watched it twice, but Johnny Erickson there's a video on YouTube. She's 60 years old now. As a teenager, she became a quadriplegic. And so she basically wanted to die. But she physically couldn't kill herself. And thankfully lived in a place where it was not legal for a physician to assist her, help her in any way. And so through her now decades and decades of ministry and how the Lord has used her, the video is called When Suffering and Sovereignty Collide. So of course, that sovereignty of God and why you memorize the promises of God, because then they would leave her, and she lives in extreme pain today. She would qualify for, medically assisted suicide because she lives in how a quadriplegic lives in pain, I don't know, but she does. But she leans into the promises of God rather than trying to escape suffering, that in his sovereignty, he has a purpose.
On that note, this is great.
Jill, thank you ever so much for your time.
Yeah,
It's a great
thank you.
story.
Clint, did you have any other words?
I did want to make one announcement, especially for students. If you enjoyed the conversation tonight, but you maybe were a little bit shy, but you wanted to get an opportunity to speak with Dr. Cherry a little bit more, not only about this topic, but just about being a Christian academic or being a Christian in college. We're going to have a lunch tomorrow at Parker's Barbecue on Memorial. If you did get enough barbecue, you are welcome to come. Mark and I are going to sort of eat, and you're welcome to come and sort of continue the conversation tomorrow.
What time?
About 12 o'clock on Memorial Drive.
I also want to plug Dr. Parker and Dr. Hudson this whole entire school year have had a really thought-provoking conversation